Hi, welcome to the Dr. Joby podcast. This week we'll be investigating the theory of Sigmund Freud. Here's part one of the lecture. I'd like to begin our exploration into Sigmund Freud's theories and ideas with an attitude. And the attitude is one of argument rather than of knowing. For example, we are not going to learn the truth or the real Freud or the facts about Freud. What we're going to do is a reading of Freud. And we're going to take this approach with every theorist that we explore in this course on theories of personality. So as I am presenting Freud and as we are looking at Freud, what we want to keep in mind is that we are doing a reading of Freud. You are being introduced to Freud through my reading of Freud. I was introduced through the readings of others' teachers. And eventually, if this interests you, you will do your own reading of Freud and present Freud in your own way. So our presentation, you are actually getting multiple presentations. You're going to read in your textbook about Sigmund Freud, and that's giving the author's reading of Freud, and you're simultaneously receiving my reading of Freud, which comes from my unique view of his ideas. So let's keep this in mind for all the theorists that we approach, that we are going to be thinking about them more than knowing about them. And you're receiving an introduction through my reading of Freud and through the author's reading of Freud. And this will be your obligation then to take that upon yourself to do your own reading and play off of what you've learned from our textbook author and from myself. I'd like to present three pitfalls that we want to be aware of when doing a reading currently of Freud's work and subsequently of the other theorists. Two of these pitfalls I've described and coined the terms of use to describe, and the third concept is one that is quite well known in the history of psychology and in thinking intellectual history. That concept is contextualization. So we want to read Freud in the context of his time period, what Hegel called the zeitgeist, the time spirit. So we're going to understand Freud not from a presentist view. That means we're not going to judge Freud's ideas by our current knowledge and standards and zeitgeist and worldview, but we are going to view Freud and read Freud from, as best as we can, a non-presentist approach from the context of his time period. So we're going to take into consideration the Victorian Viennese culture and time influences on Freud's writing. So that's referred to as the zeitgeist, or the time spirit. The other two pitfalls that I describe, one is I refer to as textbook stoogery. And textbook stoogery means that much of what we are taught in classrooms about Sigmund Freud and others are taught to us by individuals who have read about Freud in textbooks but have never read the original primary source text themselves. So I refer to this as textbook stoogery because it's really kind of a repetition without a basis of knowledge. It's relying on secondary sources. So we're going to be aware of textbook stoogery. We're going to be aware of presentism. And the third concept that I've introduced into the intellectual conversation, something I call yellow scholarship. The idea of yellow scholarship comes from another branch of academics called media studies, and it's referred to as yellow journalism. And yellow journalism is any type of overstated, over-exaggerated, sensationalistic presentation of an idea in order to sell the newspaper. So yellow journalists, today we might call this clickbaiting. Yellow journalists would really hype up the title of a story and maybe take a spin on it that's very sensationalized and hyped up in order to sell the newspaper, to get people to buy this paper to read the story. That's referred to as yellow journalism. I like to refer to this phenomenon that exists in the lecture hall and also in the text as yellow scholarship. And this is whenever you encounter a presentation of someone's ideas that over-exaggerates crudely, sensationalizes an idea to either persuade the audience in a certain way or to maybe even promote a certain view. This is quite a bit of rhetoric involved in this. So this is the concept of yellow scholarship. So we're going to be aware of these three dangers: yellow scholarship, presentism, and textbook stoogery. So the term psychoanalysis is the act of analyzing. In psychoanalytic terms, so in the overall theory of psychoanalytic theory, one performs psychoanalysis as the way of gathering information. And the primary source of information is the individual case study. So a psychoanalyst will psychoanalyze an individual, a case study, and gather information and understand that information as it fits into psychoanalytic theory. So this is a deductive method, going from theory informing individual cases. There's usually two players in this, the analyst and the analysand. So the analyst is the one who is doing the analysis, and the analysand is the one who is the patient, the one who's being analyzed. When we speak of psychoanalysis or psychoanalytic theory, we're discussing specifically the classical work of Sigmund Freud. Anything that comes after Freud, in reaction to Freud, is typically referred to as psychodynamic theory. So we today have psychoanalysts, and we also have psychodynamic psychologists. So psychoanalysis and psychoanalytic theory refer directly to Freud's theory, and psychodynamic refers to anything that is in reaction to Freud. Some brief biographical notes regarding Sigmund Freud. Freud was born in 1856 in Moravia, which is now the current Czech Republic. And at the age of 4, his father, who was a wool merchant, moved the entire family to Vienna, Austria in search for work. Freud remained in Vienna for nearly 80 years. Freud's father was 40 when Sigmund was born, and his mother was 20. So his parents had a 20-year difference between them in age. At an early age, Freud reported having hostility towards his perceived authoritarian father, and often felt that his father was somehow inferior to him as he grew older. Sigmund was the apple of his mother's eye. She was very doting, very protective, and this has often been suggested to be the reason why Freud had such a sense of self and such self-confidence. Sigmund Freud wrote, "A man who has been the indisputable favorite of his mother keeps for life the feeling of a conqueror, that confidence of success that often induces real success." And as we'll see, Freud referred to himself as an explorer and as a conqueror. So he really attributed his sense of security and sense of self to the feeling that he was, in fact, the main focus of his mother's life. And we'll see that this plays an important role in his theory of psychoanalysis. From the youngest age, Freud was very intelligent. He was fluent in both German and Hebrew. He studied and mastered Latin, Greek, French, and English, and he taught himself Italian and Spanish. He also was at the head of his class for most of his school years. Most scholars agree that Freud had a lifelong ambition for notoriety and fame, and that he entered into the medical profession not necessarily out of a desire to treat patients, but as a way to do scientific research. And it seems that from the earliest of his professional age, he was interested in finding some major scientific discovery that would that he could make his mark in history with. one of the most important readings of Freud was done by Soloway, who wrote an entire book on how Freud's earliest interest in biology influenced his psychoanalytic theory. So this was an individual who was very attracted to science, very attracted to archaeology and mythology and literature, and the earliest part of his professional career was very much rooted in biological science of medical school. As he was completing medical school, Freud met and fell in love with the woman he would eventually marry, Martha Bernays. And this only heightened Freud's desire to have fame and an adequate source of income. And this really fueled this desire for a scientific discovery and for notoriety and economic vitality. Really shaped Freud's research into what has become known as the cocaine episode. So this is an example of some of the pitfalls that we want to address. There's been a lot of sensationalized discussion of Freud's use of cocaine, and what we would like to do here is offer an historically accurate view of Freud's use of cocaine and his research with it. Cocaine was a substance that was in use in South America, in Incan tribes, and was used as a stimulant, chewing on the coca leaves. And it was eventually brought to Europe and to the United States, and found a variety of uses. It became a very popular additive to certain beverages, certain wines and tonics. And it had two properties. It was a stimulant, gave energy and focus, like any stimulant would give, and even euphoria. And it also had an anesthetic quality to it. So anything that the coca, once refined, anything that came into contact with would become numb. So there were two principal uses for cocaine in the 19th century, as it was becoming popular in pop culture, as well as in the United States it was becoming popular, and that was adding as an additive to drinks, certain wines, and to also use as an anesthetic in surgery, in particular eye surgery. If you think Novocaine is part of the same family as cocaine, so it's an anesthetic. Well, in 1884, Freud began researching on the uses of cocaine for depression and for also lethargy, and its incredible focusing quality. So the ability to, as all stimulants do, to allow focus and sustain concentration. Freud became fascinated with cocaine. In contextually speaking, as we said, cocaine was added to drinks and became very popular. This was not an illegal substance. Its addictive qualities were completely unknown at this point. And it was even being used to treat morphine addiction. One of those morphine addicts was an individual who, in the United States, was suffering from a great deal of pain due to war injury in the Civil War. And he became addicted to morphine, began drinking the coca wine that he had discovered while in France, and found that drinking the coca wine completely did away with his morphine addiction. Unfortunately, that eventually became a cocaine addiction. Well, that individual went on to find Coca-Cola, was a soft drink that had cocaine in it. So the climate of the time, cocaine was being investigated by scientists, by physicians, by soft drink and hard drink companies. It was a very popular part of the culture. Freud, in 1884, wrote a paper on cocaine, and in it he celebrated its use as a stimulant for increasing concentration and alleviating depression, and he even mentioned its anesthetic qualities for surgery. Freud went on to write quite a bit about coca. He eventually prescribed the use of cocaine to a friend who had a morphine addiction. The individual got off of morphine but became addicted to cocaine. He then got off of cocaine and went on to morphine, and he died at an early age. And Freud regretted this for the rest of his life, that he had prescribed cocaine to his friend in the hopes that it would get him over a morphine addiction, and it didn't. And Freud, to the end of his life, felt that this was a great regret. Freud used the cocaine himself in his letters to his closest friend and colleague regarding cocaine, Wilhelm Fliess. Freud mentioned cocaine to Fliess out of 300 letters in about 5 of those letters. It's evident that Freud used cocaine to some extent for about 10 years, and this was in the earliest part of his career. The last time he mentions cocaine at all is in 1896, which is about 5 years before the publication of his first work in Psychoanalysis. And his final words were that he had laid down his cocaine brush. So it looks like Freud did use cocaine. There's no real evidence that Freud was an addict of any sort with cocaine, and to suggest that cocaine played any influence in the foundation or writing of psychoanalysis seems to be inaccurate, because the first published work of Freud's dealing with psychoanalysis, his seminal work, The Interpretation of Dreams, was published in 1900 in English, 1899 in German, and the last time Freud mentions anything to do with cocaine whatsoever is around 1896. So this is what's referred to as Freud's cocaine episode, and it's an area of Freudian studies that's very controversial and is also has become ripe with things such as yellow scholarship, sensationalism, presentism, judging the use of an experimentation with cocaine from current political attitudes, and also the other pitfall that we talked about, which was textbook stoogery, and that is often we will hear individuals present the cocaine episode in a way that is suggested maybe by only reading secondary sources and not reading the original texts and letters of Freud. So in this earliest part of his scientific career, he's looking for a big breakthrough, and he thought that coca was going to be that breakthrough. And it turned out to be one of the regrets of his life. After graduation from medical school, Freud started his private practice as a clinical neurologist, and that's in 1881. And at this time, he was seeing patients who were complaining of symptoms that were collectively referred to as hysteria at the time. Now, during the 19th century, the diagnosis of hysteria, which is a sort of somatoform disorder, what we today call a somatoform disorder. Hysteria was kind of like the thing that was diagnosed when no one knew really what was going on. This is the early days of disease model, of understanding biological etiology of diseases, and so often when a physician didn't know what something was, they attributed it to hysteria. One of the main treatments of hysteria was to apply mild electric shocks to the individual, which seemed to alleviate the symptoms. The symptoms could range from coughing to rigid body to hallucinations to psychological paralysis. That means that there's the inability to feel or to move certain limbs, but there was no physiological cause to this. Freud became very fascinated by the hysteria. Now, hyster in hysteria comes from the Greek word hyster, which is uterus, and it was originally thought in ancient Greece that somehow the womb, the uterus moved within the woman's body and produced these symptoms. And this is where the word in hysteria comes from. So Freud became very interested in hysteria, and it was at this time that he won a scholarship to study in Paris with the psychiatrist Jean-Martin Charcot. And Charcot was one of the pioneers at the time in hypnosis. And so Freud traveled to Paris and studied with Charcot and learned all of the latest French theories in hypnosis and its treatment with hysteria. Charcot may have been the first individual to plant the idea in Sigmund's mind that hysteria had some sort of sexual origin. Charcot commented in a particular patient's problem was sexual origin. The quote is, "In this sort of case, it is always a question of the genitals. Always, always, always." So this is Charcot's pointing towards some sort of sexual conflict in symptomology. And this was very fascinating to Freud. This really caught Freud's attention. By 1895, Sigmund Freud and his collaborator, his colleague and teacher, Joseph Breuer, had started and completed the work of a major paper called Studies in Hysteria. And the Studies in Hysteria was based on a patient of Breuer's named Anna O. in the study. And in this, they discussed some of the ideas of Charcot and some of the ideas of Breuer himself of using talking, what is called the talking cure, to alleviate the symptoms of hysteria in a patient named Anna O. This began Freud's real. This was really Freud's his first writing and thinking in psychological illnesses and in hysteria in particular. But he worked on this with Breuer. And they discussed how talking alleviated the symptoms in their patient. And then he went on to write a few more papers on hysteria and working with Breuer, but it wasn't until 1900, and completed in 1899, published in 1900, that his seminal work, The Interpretation of Dreams, was published, which explored for the first time his theory of the unconscious. And now the unconscious is really the crux of Freudian theory. This is what separates psychoanalysis and psychodynamic theory from the rest of psychology. Wundtian psychology at the time, 1879, if you remember Wundt, who is cited many times in Freud's opening chapter to The Interpretation of Dreams, was a psychologist of consciousness. He was interested in consciousness and voluntarism, how the mind organizes conscious experience. Most of the psychologists at the time were interested in consciousness. Freud entered into the conversation the idea of the unconscious, and it was really his goal to introduce a science that could study the unconscious. Now, we know that the two hallmarks of empirical science are to measure and to observe, and that's fine for consciousness. We can measure and observe behavior. We can self-report on thinking and feeling, introspection. However, when we're in the realm of the unconscious, these are aspects of ourselves that we don't know we know. Now we are outside of the realm of traditional empirical science. And Freud proposed that we needed a new science. We needed a new systematic science to understand the unconscious. And this was his project. His project for a scientific psychology was a science of the unconscious. And this is really the beginning of psychoanalytic theory. So when we think of psychoanalysis and Freud, we're really thinking of a science, a project for a new science that could come to theorize on the unconscious. So the four main ways of scientifically investigating the unconscious are hypnosis, dream analysis, free association, and transference analysis. So, firstly, hypnosis. This is putting one into a hypnotic trance. Once the person is in the hypnotic trance, they speak on things that typically they had censored in the past. And the analyst listens to this and makes notes and starts to sketch out the unconscious, kind of like sketching the background of a tree and allowing the tree to emerge from the foreground on its own. So hypnosis is the first investigative method. Dream analysis. Freud felt that through analyzing one's dreams, or most importantly, the emotional content of dreams, one could touch on the symbolic value of those dreams, which would lead to the unconscious, understanding the individual's unconscious. The third, free association. The primary rule of psychoanalysis is do not censor yourself. Free association is having the analysand or the patient freely speak on whatever comes to their mind. The analyst listens to what the patient is talking about and listens for pauses. We call these pregnant pauses. These are pauses in which patterns will reveal of censorship, of rethinking things, of putting things in a certain way that could lead to the understanding of the backdrop of the individual's psychic life, the unconscious. And the fourth, of course, is transference analysis. Transference analysis is understanding the interaction between the analysand and the analyst. What are the common emotional and defensive themes that come up between the patient and the therapist? So, for example, when one becomes defensive, this would be an analysis of transference. When someone is treating the therapist in a way that is really projecting onto them transferred feelings from some other person in their life. So when the patient begins yelling at the therapist as if it was their father or their mother, this would be a transference analysis. So Freud said that these were the ways to get to understanding, to sketching out an individual's unconscious. Hypnosis, dream interpretation, free association, and transference analysis. Freud saw more and more patients suffering from hysteria. He incorporated the free analysis on free association, dream analysis, hypnosis, and transference analysis. And out of these, he found one thing that was surfacing over and over again, and that was the adult reporting of sexual trauma from childhood. Now, this is another area of Freud that we often see receiving maybe some sort of yellow scholarship. In fact, what we know today is that Freud grossly misunderrepresented or mispredicted the amount of childhood sexual trauma that actually does take place. Today, we know that childhood sexual abuse is a prevalent feature of society, and even more so than Freud may have known. But when Freud spoke about this at the Medical Congress in Vienna, the Viennese culture of the 19th century, this very proper culture, was not ready to hear that children were used in any way sexually. Well, as we know today, this is a very unfortunate and sad state of culture and society, the prevalence of child sexual abuse. And we do know today that although sexual abuse doesn't cause adult mental illness or psychopathology, many of individuals who have experienced childhood sexual trauma have a great deal of struggles through life. And so many of the patients that we do see in therapy have had sexual abuse issues in childhood. Well, Freud is now dealing with presenting to the medical community his ideas and his findings, his empirical findings through clinical interview, that adults who had experienced sexual trauma as children somehow manifested as adults symptoms because of these repressed childhood sexual memories. Now remember, this played directly into Charcot's words that it always, always, always is a question of the genitals. Freud came to think that all neurosis, all hysteria and psychological illness in adulthood was a result of childhood sexual trauma. Eventually, Freud replaced this idea with something he called the simple accidental trauma theory, which simply stated that as children, a child started to have certain biological reactions to an adult sitting next to them, perhaps, and not understanding what these sensations were, these naturally occurring biological sensations were, became confused and suppressed them, repressed them, and then as adults re-experienced these as trauma that had never actually taken place. That theory, that more biologically oriented theory, biological reaction theory, gave way to his final theory, which was that there was a seduction fantasy that was a human universal. And this was illustrated in the literature, cross-cultural literature, in which we find stories of children who are trying to possess the mother and reject the father. So this was very controversial. Of course, 1905 was it was a seminal year for Freud, as it was for Einstein in his theory of relativity papers. Freud produced his theories of childhood sexuality, and he was really chastised for this, the suggestion that children could have sexual fantasies. Of course, today we understand that children do not understand sexuality in the way an adult would understand sexuality, but do have some sexual reactions in earliest childhood. So many of these concepts that Freud proposed that were very controversial and upsetting for Viennese society at the time have actually turned out to have, we know today, have great validity. Keeping in mind contextually what Vienna's like at the time, this is a time of great sexual repression. Husbands and wives not talking about sex at all, but sex being one of the taboo discussions in polite culture and bourgeois culture. But we have at the same time an epidemic of syphilis and venereal diseases, much of which went diagnosed as hysteria. We also have brothels and times we have anonymous letters of the time and novels of the time describing exploits of children and prostitutes. So simultaneously, there were two structures of culture going on in Vienna at the time. There was the surface level, or maybe the conscious level culture, where people were very repressed and very there were taboo conversations about sex and sexuality. And then there was an undercurrent, might even say a cultural unconscious, where there was rampant sexually transmitted diseases, syphilis in particular, prostitution, and all sorts of sexual aberrations. So this is really contextually, culturally, Freud's theory of a conscious and unconscious was present in this very society he was living in, and Freud was cognizant of this, and this made its way into his initial theories of psychosexual manifestations of neurosis. Next, we'll turn to the theory itself and begin to understand the foundations of Freud's psychoanalytic theory. Hi, welcome to the Dr. Joby podcast. This is episode 21, which is lecture 2, part 2 on Sigmund Freud. When introducing Freud's theory of personality, I think it's important that we keep in mind that the personality theory he developed was one which was at the service of understanding psychopathology. We can still see some remnants of this in contemporary DSM diagnosis categories in the personality disorders. For most of psychodynamic thinkers and in Freud's thinking, symptoms manifest within the context of a personality, and this is exactly why it was so important for Freud to develop a theory of personality in his effort to understand psychological neurosis, psychological disorders. So when we consider that when anxiety sets in for any of us, whatever the anxiety-inducing situation could be, each of us would manifest symptoms differently within the context of our own character structure. And this is really at the heart of any psychodynamic thinking. So an individual who has a personality structure that would lend itself towards anxiety, or maybe another person would have a personality structure in which an individual would manifest symptoms of depression. And this is really how we understand the origins of a theory of personality in psychodynamic thinking, and specifically Freud's first endeavor in doing so. So we're going to keep in mind that Sigmund Freud developed his theory of personality as a way of understanding how neurosis, psychopathology, manifested in individuals. Freud's theory of personality really begins with the publishing of the interpretation of dreams in 1900. Before that, Freud had investigated with Joseph Breuer studies in hysteria, which really was the impetus for his exploration into psychopathology. But with the interpretation of dreams, we see the beginning of his theory of personality and his archaeological approach to studying the psyche. Sigmund Freud's theory of personality and of psychopathology didn't come out of the oven completely baked. It's a theory that unfolds over the course of 40 years. With the beginning, the first publication of the Interpretation of Dreams in 1900, we see some basic elements of his theory. And I would like to start with those basic elements, start with the discussion of those basic elements. And we have to keep in mind that Freud's theory unfolded over 40 years. So there are times when reading the older writings of Freud contradict the more recent writings of Freud, and this shouldn't be seen as some sort of a contradiction or something negative about Freud's theory. This should be seen as the scientific process of a theory that's in development. So a year that's usually used as a demarcation point in Freudian scholarship is 1920. We see Freud's theory really building on the individual, and then around 1920 we see a shift in writing about culture and society, and the application of psychoanalytic theory to culture and to society, and even to mass psychology of the groups. Freud was a great synthesizer. Freud had very few ideas that were uniquely his own, but what he did, and he did well, was to broadly combine the ideas of other individuals, people who even lived thousands of years before him in ancient Greece and before, and integrate it and synthesize these ideas into a scientific theoretical model. I like to think of Freud as a combination of Judaism, philosophy, and biology. If we think of Freud in this way, we can understand this melding of different aspects. Freud saw himself as a conquistador, as an archaeologist, as a discoverer and an explorer. And in so doing, he applied many of the concepts of the archaeologist and the anthropologist to his theory of digging into the psyche. I'm going to make an attempt to present Freud's theory in its final form, but I'm going to do so chronologically. In other words, we're going to begin with the concepts that remained in Freud's final version of his theory of personality as they appeared in his earliest works, and worked through from 1900 until 1939, and unfold his theory chronologically. And in so doing, we're going to leave out the ideas that were discarded, and I'm going to present the ideas that were that Freud retained in the final version of his theory upon his death. So hopefully this will give us a very solid starting place for the listener then to go and explore Freud's psychoanalytic personality theory on their own. We begin with exploring the concept of the unconscious. Unconscious is the hallmark characteristic of psychoanalytic and psychodynamic thought. It, until more recently, has been unique to psychoanalysis. And now other areas of psychology have been looking into unconscious processes under a variety of different names. But this is really the foundational theory, hallmark of the theory of Freud's personality theory, is the existence of the unconscious. And so let's just take a moment to describe what is meant by the unconscious as it first appears in the interpretation of dreams. And incidentally, it also appeared in Studies in Hysteria with Breuer, but it was very much developed in Freud's 1900 publication of The Interpretation of Dreams. The concept of the unconscious is something that we can find in the philosophy of Arthur Schopenhauer and Friedrich Nietzsche. Both of these philosophers had a great impact on Freud's theory, and it has even been suggested by Freud himself that one should begin with Schopenhauer before studying psychodynamic theory or psychoanalytic theory. But the concept of the unconscious is really the idea that there are certain pressures, certain drives, certain emotional occurrences that originate outside of our conscious awareness. So if Wilhelm Wundt and William James and others described a psychology of consciousness, Freud was really interested in that which was beyond our conscious perception, things that pushed us emotionally and biologically at an unconscious level. So he really made a distinction between the conscious and the unconscious. The conscious is things that we are aware of. The unconscious is aspects of our mental processing, aspects of our emotional lives, of our fantasy lives, things that we are not consciously aware of. And quite possibly at the core of these are what these pressures, these unconscious pressures, are things that that Freud referred to as Trieb. Now, the German word Trieb literally means drives. So drives, you'll also find that this is translated into English as instincts. I prefer drives. Instincts, I think, has a different connotation to it in English, but I want to talk about drives. So you may, in your reading, find instincts, and I want you to be aware that this is identical to what I'm using the term drives for. And just a note on this, now drives are desires. And these desires can ultimately be physical in nature, biological in nature, meaning hunger drive, sex drive, thirst drive are examples. And Freud described in The Interpretation of Dreams that these biological drives manifest as psychological wishes. So a drive of thirst, of hunger, of sex, this desire manifests as a psychological disequilibralization. So we have a drive that is largely unconscious to ourselves, that we're not aware of, and it puts certain biological pressures, a state of unpleasure, that pushes us in a psychological or emotional state to seek out a resolution of that unpleasure. So we want to shift from unpleasure to pleasure. And this is what's referred to as the pleasure principle in the drive. This is what Arthur Schopenhauer referred to as the will. But for Freud, we call these unconscious drives. These drives fall into two categories. First, Freud referred to the life drive, and later he described something that was very controversial called the death drive. So Freud claimed that at an unconscious level, our life drive, our eros, is a struggle towards survival and a struggle towards procreation, towards passing on our genes. And the death instinct is an unconscious, or death drive is an unconscious drive towards aggression and self-destruction, return to the inorganic. Now, of course, because these are unconscious, we're unaware of these drives, this drive of sexual desire, and maybe this drive of towards death, the thanatos versus the eros, and the aggressive drive, this compulsion to destroy and to conquer and to kill, which in a way has a very inverse, or maybe even a synergistic relationship with the drive towards life. I mean, what we're looking here is the aggressive drive, as the desire to conquer, is simultaneously a desire to destroy and a desire to sustain one's own life. In his earliest writings, Freud saw the psychic conscious and unconscious system as a closed system that had certain energy, and that energy he referred to as libidinal energy, or libido. And this goes beyond simply libido being used in the common contemporary way as a sexual energy, as libido being a life force, the energy, the angst, the energy that is the form of the combustion engine that gives us the desire to move, to do things, to pursue things. So libido is very much connected to anxiety in a certain way. These are these energies of moving from unpleasure to pleasure that are existent in the earliest moments of birth in the newborn. Later, Freud introduced the concepts of the topography of the psyche, and he made a distinction between different levels of our personality, some of which existed to our conscious awareness and others that existed at an unconscious level. So it's really not until about 1920 that Freud enters into the conversation the idea of what we call in English the id, the ego, and the superego. So this is 20 years after the idea of the conscious and the unconscious. It's with this model of the structure of this, or topography of the psyche, or the structure of personality, that we often see an iceberg associated with this theory. The iceberg sitting in the water representing consciousness above the water surface, unconscious in the deepest level of the surface, and a small area called the preconscious, which is really memories and thinking, retrieval. Some of the things we do in study in cognitive psychology today are part of the preconscious. This iceberg model was originated by Gustav Fechner, and Freud mentioned it in a conversation to his biographer, Ernest Jones, but Freud never used the model himself. And it's also important to realize that Freud didn't use the terms id, ego, or superego. These were inserted with the English translation. But we're going to refer to these as id, ego, and superego, which is just standard in English use of the terms. So what we have is at the unconscious and the conscious level, the majority of one's personality, Freud theorized, was unconscious to us. There were things about ourselves that we just didn't know that we know. The largest chunk of this is what Freud referred to as the id. In Latin, id literally means it, the thing. And what I would like you to consider for the id is corresponding to contemporary biological psychology. The id is all about biological drives. It's all about the sustaining of satisfaction of thirst, of hunger, and sexual pleasures. The id is really biological drives. So today, in contemporary terms, biological psychology, genetic predisposition, all these things are really what Freud referred to as the id, the thing. We can also, and the id exists entirely in the unconscious. Just like we're unaware of our genetic pressures, of our biological pressures, of our evolutionary predispositions, what we might call hardwired, we are unaware of these things. Freud said these existed in the unconscious. So this is what we refer to as the id. The id functions on what we refer to as the pleasure principle. And the pleasure principle is the drive of the organism to avoid unpleasure and to exist in a state of homeostasis, of pleasure, or even the lack of unpleasure and contentedness. So it's this constant push and this constant repetition of frustration and satisfaction, and this is what Freud referred to on a social level or a personality level as repetition compulsion. And this is the idea that we have a compulsion to repeat certain scenarios over and over in our lives. We might find ourselves in conflicts that seem different, but they're actually identical conflicts repeated over and over in life that we keep resolving in the same way. And through this, we go through a cycle of tension and release, tension and release. This, of course, is Freud took directly from Schopenhauer. Freud described these id pressures as almost like a childlike state. He referred to this kind of thinking as primary process thinking. And this is very demanding, I want it now, childish kind of thinking. Those of you who would be interested in exploring this further, the theoretical system of transactional analysis can be found in the writings of Eric Berne, and also in books such as I'm Okay, You're Okay, in which the introduction and first chapter of I'm Okay, You're Okay outlines how transactional analysis is really an easy-to-get and easy-to-use version of Freudian psychoanalytic theory. What transactional analysis refers to as the child ego state is identical to Freud's idea of the id. It's a very demanding, I want satisfaction now, impulsive kind of pressures that function on primary process thought. This is very much right now satisfaction, don't worry about the long-term consequences kind of drives. In his 1923 text, The Ego and the Id, Freud describes how the ego, which is Latin for the myself, the I, the me, manifests from the id. So the id is the stuff from which the ego manifests. And what is the ego? What is the I? The I is the what corresponds today possibly to cognitive psychology, to thinking, decision making, to aspects of how decisions are made in one's life. And the ego really exists in what is called the reality principle. The ego is in consciousness. It's what we know of ourselves. It's the me, the I that knows the me. And the reality principle is the ego trying to function within the external environment. So the ego really is caught in between the reality of the external environment and the unconscious biological urges and pressures of the id, of the it. So we have the I and the it and reality. The ego exists in something called secondary process thought, and that's mature thought, dealing with rationally, dealing with and logically dealing with the outside world. So if the id is noted of primary process, childlike, demanding thinking, secondary process thought characterizes the ego, and in transactional analysis, this is called the adult ego state. So at this point, Freud's really describing a conflict between biological drives and the external reality world, and the ego, which has to maintain a satisfaction between the unconscious drives and the reality of the world. That reality of the world is not the only pressure on the ego. The ego also has to, the individual in their ego, their self, has to manage the pressures of the rules of society, of morality. And in particular, these are learned from our parents. Parents are considered to be our earliest society. And at an unconscious level, this means we have morality that was laid out for us before we had any idea of a sense of self, before ego existed. So out of the id, out of the thing, also grew something called superego. And again, Freud didn't use the term superego, but in the Latin, superego means the above me, the punitive me. So this would be morality, what is good and what is bad. Now we know that superego or morality or ethics changes from culture to culture. So morality or conscience is not something that is universal to all human beings. It's something that is culturally specific, societally specific. In his later work, Civilization and Its Discontents, Freud characterizes the struggle of man as being one between the rules of society and the biological drives. As security increases, the satisfaction of biological drives decreases. So Freud really said that this superego, this above me, which was partly existing in the unconscious, learned from our parents before we were cognizant of ourselves. It's partially something we are aware of in consciousness, and is really divided into two aspects: conscience, which is a culturally specific and even familially or family-specific understanding of what is right and what is wrong, morality, and what is something else called the ego ideal. And this is the idea of an individual of what they should be. The ego ideal is the best, the ideal or the best that this person could be in their own imagination. Now, this is important because we're going to find that this becomes the center of Alfred Adler's individual psychology, which we'll be talking about in the future. But to recap this, this structure of the psyche, this topography of the soul that we have for Freud, is one that is firstly id, thing, anxieties, libidinal energies that consist of both strivings to survive and strivings to have aggression, drives of death, thanatos and eros. Out of this id grows out of the id, the ego, the I, the me, and also the superego, which is the family and eventually society's rules and regulations of what is right and wrong. Now, we're going to go into detail in our next segment of this lecture to understand how these three manifest through the psychosexual stages of human development that Freud proposed. But for right now, let's remember that the ego is constantly trying to handle and satisfy demands, biological demands of the id, those drives, the social demands of the parents and of laws of society and religion and ethics and all of these things that Freud represented in the individual as the superego, and also reality, the world that we live in. And so the ego is really trapped in a position of having to satisfy demands of the superego, the id, within reality of the world. In transactional analysis, if you look into this, and again, transactional analysis is an invaluable resource to really understand Freudian theory in a very applicable way to everyday life. In transactional analysis, the superego is referred to as the parent ego state. And we can have parents that are very demanding, and they can be so demanding that we lose a sense of self, or we even submit to their control. So we can have a punitive, demanding parent, or we can also have a nurturing parent, a parent that keeps us secure and safe. So the superego should not be viewed as some sort of something that's good necessarily, because we know that individuals can become morality bound. They can become what Freud referred to as a moral sadomasochist. This is the individual who lives by the superego. They go around pointing out others' sins and wagging the finger. And this is even some psychoanalytic thinkers propose that this personality type that is dominated by the superego goes into certain professions. Professions that are interested in enforcing laws and punishing others and setting the record straight. And we can see this manifest as a certain personality type when one is dominated by their superego. So these are the three main aspects of basic Freudian theory, as is referred to as the id, the ego, and the superego. Freud's terms were id. He used the German term das Es, the thing. Superego is Über-Ich, which is the above I, and for id he used the German term Ich, meaning I, the me. Again, id, ego, and superego were added as Latinized terms in the English translation, and they don't exist in Freud's original writings. Hi, welcome to the Dr. Joby podcast. This is Lecture 2, Part 3, Sigmund Freud, Theory of Personality. We turn our attention in this part of our lecture to Freud's dealing with anxiety. Now, Sigmund Freud referred to anxiety as an objectless fear. So this would be a dread or a fear, the term angst, that arises in the individual as a form of disequilibrialization, of unpleasure, that seeks to resolve this into a state of homeostasis, a state of pleasure, or a state of the absence of unpleasure, of contentedness. So we really talk about anxiety and its role as a threat to the sense of self, or to the me, to the ego. Real dangers that exist in the environment, animal attack and natural catastrophes, things like this, threats to life. This is what's referred to as reality anxiety or objective anxiety. And for Freud, reality anxiety was the fear of actual things that were real. But there were two other forms of anxiety that manifested or were derived from reality anxiety. And those two forms of anxiety are neurotic anxiety and moral anxiety. Now, moral anxiety arises from a conflict between biological drives, those id drives, the drives of the unconscious, with coming into conflict with one's moral code, or the superego. So it's really a conflict between superego demands and drive demands. And this is what's referred to as moral anxiety. And this manifests in the sensation or the phenomenon of guilt. Guilt is also considered by Freud to be the fear of the loss of love. So when we have the feeling of guilt, Freud said we should ask ourselves, who or what's love do we fear losing? So this idea of shame, guilt, this anxiety that comes out, moral anxiety, is a conflict between drives, unconscious drives, and superego demands. The other form of anxiety, neurotic anxiety, Freud claimed had its roots in childhood, and it was the result of being maybe scolded for expressing id desires. So it really is a conflict between the id and the ego, between the thing, das Es, and the me, the ego, I. And it's an unconscious fear of being punished for impulsively displaying id-dominated behavior. So this is really an unconscious, neurotic fear of expressing one's desire. It's really not a fear of the desire itself. It's a fear of what happens if one expresses that desire. Now, just as Freud used Plato's model of a chariot driver trying to satisfy the demands of a wild, lascivious horse and a righteous, golden path horse, the chariot driver would represent our ego. The lascivious horse would be our id, aspect of our id, and the the self-righteous moral horse would be, or morally preoccupied horse would be the superego. We find this in Plato's Republic. The protection of the anxiety that exists for the ego. The ego has defenses against these anxieties that arise from demands of the superego and demands of our id. It's difficult to speak of the id and the superego as part of ourselves, and I think this is why Freud used the terms Über Ich and Das Es. It's the thing and the over parts of ourselves, the punitive parts of ourselves that make demands on us, and this creates the anxiety, and the ego defends against this anxiety. It protects from this anxiety, and this is what we classically call the defense mechanisms. Defense mechanisms are self-preservation attempts. These are the ego's way of preserving a view of itself that is safe and secure, a view of myself that is comfortable for me. And so these defense mechanisms usually distort and deny aspects of reality and aspects of the id and aspects of the superego. It's a way that we preserve our sense of ego integrity. Now, there are 8 such defense mechanisms that Freud described, and we are going to look at each of these 8 and describe them. And these defense mechanisms are typically found to be characteristic of individuals' personality styles, their way of being, their strategy for living. And what we find is that typically we all use each of these 8 in a variety of ways in particular situations, and this is what we describe as personality structure. However, some individuals neurotically use one of these exclusively, and when that happens, we call it a symptom. Now, all of these defense mechanisms function at an unconscious level. So in other words, we're unable to see it in ourselves, but others can see the defense mechanisms that we use quite clearly. And this is exactly why we would go to a psychoanalyst to be analyzed, and that would be for the analyst to describe our characteristic patterns of defense mechanisms. The first defense mechanism I'd like to describe is projection. And I choose this first because Freud claimed that all of the other defense mechanisms served projection. Projection is literally projecting one's unconscious self onto some external object. So projection would be the idea that there are aspects of ourselves that we are incapable of seeing. But when we describe something outside of ourselves, we are necessarily projecting our unconscious backdrop, the unconscious canvas of our worldview, or our Weltanschauung, onto the thing we're looking at. So, for example, if we go to a film and we watch a film, necessarily much of what we describe about that film will be unique to us. So if we come home and describe the film we've seen to a friend, that description will tell more about ourselves, more about what we found important or resonating in that film, than it will about the film itself. The same is true if we look at a work of art, or listen to a piece of music, or read a piece of literature, or, for example, in projective tests, using an ink blot or a thematic apperception card. When we describe things, when we unwrite, we project onto these things our worldviews, our unconscious backdrop. Now, the word speculation is very interesting. When we speculate, the word speculate comes from the Latin speculum, which is a mirror. And this has the idea that when we think about something, when we speculate and describe something, what we're actually doing is giving a reflection of ourselves in that thing. So projection is the idea that we see ourselves, unconscious aspects of ourselves, in other things. So we should always be aware of strong opinions and strong emotional content, such as defensiveness, because this, according to psychoanalysis, is an opportunity to learn about aspects of our character that are typically hidden from us. So the way that projection serves to protect our ego is that if we hold a view of ourselves that might be inconsistent with the true nature of ourselves, we tend to become very eager to become morally aggressive and point the finger at those aspects of ourselves we don't want to see in ourselves when they're present in another person. And so that is projection. So in other words, if we like to view ourselves as someone with a great deal of self-control and reserve, we might become hostile and angry and punitive towards others that we see as not possessing these qualities. And the very essence of this is a projection. It means that somehow deep inside of ourselves, we're insecure about this aspect in ourselves. So even though to all external evidence, we might seem to be very self-controlled and self-disciplined, we may be actually struggling with a very strong desire to be reckless and impulsive. And when we see this recklessness, impulsiveness in another person, we can lash out at it. And in fact, we are attacking ourselves when we do this. Another of the ego defense mechanisms is referred to as reaction formation. And reaction formation occurs when we express the very opposite of the thing we desire. So it's almost like an undoing behavior. Say we have a very strong impulse towards some sort of sexual activity, and in a way for us to almost convince ourselves that we don't have this impulse, we become very violently aggressive towards that attitude. A common example is the individual who is a member of the anti-smoking coalition and expresses publicly how bad cigarettes are, but yet we find them participating in cigarette smoking in private and secretive. So this would be a reaction formation. This is the idea that one protests too much. Whenever one is too vigilant to protest too much about something, it's typically a red flag for a psychoanalyst that this is a part of their personality that they are trying to protect themselves from knowing. They're trying to, in fact, undo by overzealously expressing its very opposite. Freud described one of the classic ego defense mechanisms against anxiety producing material called repression. And repression is when we take something we know and we bury it deep in the unconscious. This is something that is too disturbing for us to come to terms with, so even though we know it, somehow we hide it from ourselves. This was one of the most fascinating aspects of the human endeavor, the idea that we conveniently, selectively remember things that we want to remember and push out of our minds things that we don't want to remember. Of course, the problem with repression is, as Freud pointed out, everything gets in. What we choose to remember, we can express and talk about. What we choose not to remember gets buried deep within ourselves and manifests eventually as a symptom. Related to repression is denial. Denial is when we come into contact with something in the environment, a true external threat, but we deny that threat exists. So there's something in existence that's truly threatening to our well-being, which produces anxiety, and the way we cope with this is by completely keeping it from our conscious awareness. Anxiety-producing ego defense of intellectualization is best illustrated with the idea of sticking to the facts. Someone who intellectualizes discounts emotional validity of any argument and says, let's just stick to the facts. So in other words, when someone is trying to distance themselves from the significant impact of emotions, one distances themselves and remains, quote-unquote, objective. This is called intellectualization. Freud claimed that much of science was the use of the objective science was the use of the defense mechanism of intellectualization. Whenever you would have an argument with someone and you start to tell them the way you feel, and they say, well, this is subjective, this is just emotions, let's stick to the facts, that individual is then using the defense mechanism of intellectualization. Related and often confused with intellectualization is rationalization, and rationalization comes with using logic, using the rules of logic to do what one truly wants to do even though it might produce anxiety in some way. So rationalization, logic doesn't get you to the correct answer. Logic simply gets you to an answer, and it depends where you're starting from. So you can use logic, you can use rationality to get anywhere, depending on where you start from. So rationalization could be if you have a behavior that's unacceptable and you want to make it less threatening, you rationalize it. So in other words, maybe one smokes cigarettes, and their the way to rationalize the anxiety for its health risks might be they rationalize, well, I smoke organic cigarettes, so therefore the additives and chemicals that are in typical cigarettes aren't affecting me. That would be rationalization. I just want to point out that many times people confuse rationalization with intellectualization. Remember, intellectualization is avoiding emotional content. Rationalization is using logic to justify an anxiety-producing behavior or thought. Another characteristic personality structure that reduces anxiety from the ego is displacement. And that is the idea that we displace our aggressive tendencies from an object that could be risky or could cause us trouble or more anxiety to one that's safe. So classic example of this is displacing anger towards one's boss onto a family member or a pet. Abusing a pet or another person would be displaced anger from some authority figure in one's life. Displacement can be understood. Bullying could be an understanding of displacement. The child bullies another child. They are typically angrily punishing something in themselves or even a parent that's been abusive to them, but they, of course, cannot lash out against the parent because it could cause great physical harm if they're being abused. So they find someone that is less of a threat to take their anger out on, and this is displacement. Finally, the ego defense mechanism to reduce anxiety that is one of the most fascinating for personality is called sublimation. And sublimation is altering or displacing one's desires, one's forbidden desires, these id desires and drives, onto something that is socially acceptable. So, for example, one who might want to have a destructive desire, an aggressive desire, may seek out a profession in demolitions or in some sort of military occupation where they would be shooting people and things of this nature. This is sublimation is redirecting psychical energies that are threatening into an outlet that is socially acceptable. Now, one final ego defense mechanism that reduces anxiety is regression. And regression will be our segue into understanding Freud's proposal of how personality structure develops. And I'm going to explain regression to you as I am describing the psychosexual stages of personality development. And that is what we will turn to in the next part of this lecture. Hi, welcome to the Dr. Joby podcast. This is part 4 of lecture 2 on Sigmund Freud. Although we do understand the unfolding of the psychosexual stages of development as being centered around sexuality, and in particular childhood sexuality, to refer to this as a sex drive is a little misleading. And that's because Freud really used the term sex in a much broader sense than is used in common everyday language. When we talk about sexual drives and erogenous zones, we're really talking about the areas of the body in which the focus at a certain age from shifting from unpleasure to pleasure. And that's really what's meant here by sex in a large sense, a shifting of unpleasure to pleasure. And we find that through observation that Freud describes various stages in which which areas of the body are focused upon in this transmission of the unpleasure to the pleasure in childhood. Most of Freud's writing on child psychosexual development occurs in his 1905 Three Essays in Sexuality, his 1926 Inhibition, Symptoms, and Anxiety, and his 1909 lecture, 5 introductory lectures to psychoanalysis, which he delivered at Clark University here in the United States. So we have to understand that when the infant is born, the newborn is a bundle of libidinal energy. It's a bundle of anxieties, of unpleasures, and it's seeking to shift to a homeostatic state of pleasure, of at least the absence of unpleasure. And how does the newborn do this? When the first year of life, how does the infant do this? Well, primarily through the mouth, through crying and through feeding. This is what is referred to as Freud as the erogenous zone, the activity that is taken to shift from a state of unpleasure to a state of pleasure is either through feeding. So feeding relieves anxiety, as does crying and screaming relieve anxiety. So in adulthood, we can relate to this if we eat out of anxiety. Anxiety eating is a squelching of anxiety, a reduction of anxiety through eating, through incorporating. Whereas crying oneself to sleep is another form of energy release, of anxiety release through crying, through screaming, etc. So we do, in fact, retain these abilities in adulthood, but for the infant in the first year of life, Freud points out the entire area of the body in which anxieties are regulated is through the mouth, in his opinion. This is either through taking in or through pushing out. The child relieves its anxiety through sucking, through even biting and swallowing, and also through screaming, and crying. So Freud pointed out that there could be some very individually specific situations that consequentially result in personality structure. So although the id is a pretty universal thing for Freud, these drives of hunger and sex, the ego and the superego are extremely malleable and highly specific from one individual to another, and are not as easily generalizable. They depend on things like the environment, on parenting styles, etc. Certainly one example of this would be an overindulgent parent who is feeding the child or breastfeeding the child or giving the child the bottle even when the child is not interested in the bottle. This might be a parent who has a strong desire to interact with the child and is excessive in their feeding of the child. Freud said that this excessive breastfeeding or excessive bottle feeding could lead to a certain fixation, an overindulgence in this stage. And this would be the child who becomes fixated in an oral incorporative personality style. An individual who's an adult individual who is fixated in the oral stage, has a fixation, would turn to maybe smoking and sucking on things and biting pens and eating during adult anxiety. And we call this character type, this personality type, an oral incorporative personality type. Now, the direct opposite of this is true as well. The neglectful parent, the parent who does not attend to the child's needs, the child learns to cry and scream itself to sleep. And this also is an extreme that Freud described would turn into a fixation. And in the adult personality manifestation, when an adult would regress during moments of anxiety, the adult became what would be known as oral aggressive character. And an oral aggressive character is one in which the person is biting and sadistic and maybe spitting out and arguing, someone who attacks others verbally. So we have two basic personality styles that manifest from the first erogenous zone in childhood, the oral stage, which would be the oral incorporative personality style or the oral aggressive personality style. Now, young infants in the first year who are given just the right balance of their needs from the parent progress into the second stage, which is the anal stage of personality development. Typically between the ages of 1 and 3, some physical changes begin to take place in the child, which manifests in a shifting of where anxieties are shifted from a state of unpleasure to pleasure. And in particular, we're talking about the musculature of the body. Limbs are becoming strong enough, the musculation is taking place that the child can support itself. We have a few other things taking place, which is the ability to learn control of the sphincter muscle to hold in bowel movement, and also to constrict and control bladder release in urination. And all of these things together are centered around ideas of autonomy and volition. For instance, the child is able to stand by year 1. By year 2, the child is volitionally moving around, exploring the environment on its own. Volition is developing, autonomy is developing, a distinct separation from the need for parents to direct the child. So instead of pointing at things, the child is now able to mobilize towards things. And what we get is a manifestation of the mastery of self-regulation, of the ability to see something or to sense something, to have a feeling of unpleasure or anxiety or desire, and then to actively, volitionally do things to satisfy that desire, to shift to pleasure from unpleasure. So this is referred to as the anal stage typically because the predominant issue at hand at this age is toilet training. And this really, for Freud, is when the child is, the superego is manifesting for the first time. The child's learning morality, and what is the basis of morality is pooping and peeing at the correct place in the correct time. A good little boy and bad little boy, or good little girl and bad little girl, depending on self-control, control of the bladder, control of the bowel movement for the correct place at the correct time. This is the basis of morality, and the eruption, the manifestation of the superego. We also find that there can be two contrasted, dramatic approaches to the potty training. One would be a very liberal potty training, where the child is able to relieve itself any place and any time. And this is what's referred to as an anal explosive character type in adulthood. The anal explosive character type has very little sense of self-control. They are typically viewing themselves as someone who is at the whim of their environment. So an individual who's an adult, when anxiety sets in and pressures of life set in, that is fixated in the anal stage, in the anal explosive stage, they might be an individual who just kind of goes with the flow, is like a leaf floating in a stream down the water. What can I do? And maybe in extreme ways lets go of reality and enters into a completely helpless fantasy life, as we see in Psychosis. For the opposite, the severe potty training, the rigid potty training, well, of course, this is the very well-known and famous anal retentive personalities type. This is the individual at the diametric opposite of the anal explosive. The anal retentive is the individual who thinks they can control everything. This is the individual who thinks that all matters in life, good and bad, are a product of their decisions, and that they are living life like a train on the tracks, head down, full speed ahead. The more rules, the better. The more rules, the safer one feels. And when the adult who's fixated in the anal stage is an anal retentive individual, when life starts to get hectic, things start to become anxiety producing, they will create more rules for themselves. We might see this in contemporary terms in the obsessive compulsive personality style, the individual who's a very rigid personality style, even the moral authoritarian rigidity of the individual who feels safest not only in making rules for themselves, but can also feel safe in a certain sadistic way of putting those rules onto others. So this is really the two fixations of the anal stage, the anal explosive character and the anal retentive character type. We certainly want to keep in mind that at this stage, self-control and self-regulation are at the focus of adult styles of character. And in the extremes, the adult who is fixated in either end of this would either feel that they are in control of nothing in life or that they were in control of everything. And both of these obviously are a neurotic attitude. And we have our contemporary equivalents to these today in internal and external locus of controls and things of this attitudes in cognitive psychology. Typically between the ages of 4 years and 5 years of age, the child's erogenous areas of anxiety release begin to shift towards the phallus, towards the phallic, the penis and the vagina. And the children will come into confrontation and conflict with social demands, again, a further development of the superego. Little boys, little girls will begin touching themselves, and it feels good. They'll receive pleasure from touching themselves, and adults typically will scorn them for doing this. And this is one of the issues of superego moral development. We also have three important concepts that Freud introduces at this time. First is his classic Oedipal situation, the Oedipus complex. This is what he felt was a universal human experience that little children, little boys in particular, he spoke of, wanted to eliminate the father as a potential rival for the mother's love and wanted to be the main reason for the mother's existence, wanted to feel that they themselves could fulfill the mother's existence completely. Of course, as far as sexuality is concerned, Freud may have emphasized a sexual, ancestral basis to this, but really typically we take it as symbolic. In other words, that the child symbolically wants to feel as if they're the main reason for the mother's existence. They are fulfilling every need of the mother. Well, this becomes a problem because the child, Freud says, notices that the father and mother interact in ways different, that the mother interacts with the child. So mommy looks at daddy in ways that mommy doesn't look at the young boy in the same way. And this is what is the Oedipal situation. A successful Oedipal complex is a successful resolution of the Oedipal complex is rather fascinating how Freud arrives at it. So what I'd like to do is first walk us through something that's also happening at this time and then go to the successful resolution of the Oedipal situation. Simultaneously with this seeing of the father as the rival and for the mother's love, little boys and little girls, Freud said, at this age begin exploring each other's genitals, what's under your trousers kind of game. And what is discovered is quite profound for the children. The little boy, Freud claims, sees the little girl's genitals and develops a belief that the father who the child threatened castrated the little boy, turning him into a little girl. And this is what Freud called castration anxiety. Forevermore, the little boy fears that if he rebels against his father, keeps pushing his father away in order to possess the mother, the father will chop off his penis, castrate him, and make him into a little girl. Freud said that the little girl in exchange looks and sees the little boy's penis, and for the first time feels a sense of inferiority, wondering, where is mine? All I have is the absence of the phallus, of the penis. Now, Freud makes a very interesting move here. He says that women, for the rest of their lives, seek to possess a penis of their own, and that little boys are called into the confrontation with their Oedipal situation. We can take this symbolically. Contemporary feminism has and post-feminism has spoken at a great deal about phallocentrism, and this begins with a psychoanalyst named Jacques Lacan, who introduced the idea that we do, of course, live in a phallocentric culture, a male-dominated culture. And if we take this in terms of symbolic use of power, that men are fearing the loss of power and women are seeking to gain the power, on a sociological level, it makes perfect sense. But this takes us to the question of whether or not we can leave the actual biological sense that Freud has proposed for us, like Lacan did. So we can, more contemporary psychoanalysts and psychodynamic thinkers, Jacques Lacan is not someone that we're studying in this personality theory course, but it's someone that you may want to look into. And Erik Erikson, who we will be looking into, is one who developed this idea of the symbolic value of the phallus as symbol of power. So how is the Oedipal situation resolved? Well, the little boy, realizing that if he keeps challenging the father, he might be castrated, decides that there's a safer bet to conquer the father, and that is to become like him. The more he becomes like the father, the more the mother will like him, and the less of a threat the father will be to him. And this is what Freud referred to as the identification with aggressor. Identification with aggressor is the way forward in surpassing the Oedipal situation. It is becoming that thing which threatens us most in order to master the threat. And Freud said that's what a successful Oedipal situation is. The little boy begins to dress like daddy, act like daddy, idolize daddy, and this is a way of mastering the fear of castration from the father. And the unsuccessful Oedipal situation is one in which the child remains poorly integrated with the father, resentful of the father is resentful towards the son, the child and father each see each other as competitors for the mother's love, and in adulthood the son has come to replace the living father in the mother's life. And that would be an unresolved Oedipal situation. So this brings us to a discussion of what a fixation in the phallic stage looks like in adulthood. And Freud said that an individual who is fixated in phallic stage, an adult phallic personality, would be someone who uses other human beings as a means to an end rather than an end in themselves. So in other words, someone who uses others as masturbatory tools, physical objects. These are organs without persons behind them. So this is the individual who has sex in a way that Erik Erikson described as genital combat, can only see other humans and other people as a way of satisfying their own narcissistic sexual needs. This would not be mature, healthful lovemaking that is made distinct by the genital stage. The genital stage, the final stage of psychosexual development, is nothing to do with genitals. It has everything to do with generativity, with the ability of generating offspring, generating love, and generating some sort of contribution to society as a whole. This is where Freud claims we master in the genital stage, the ability to generate. An individual who has successfully completed and integrated in the genital stage makes love. The individual who is fixated in the phallic stage uses other people for their own sexual narcissistic pleasures. And this is really where we see the root of narcissism. So in between the phallic stage and the genital stage being the final period, is a little moment of calm in the storm, and it's the latency period. And the latency period is around age 5 till about puberty, where sex instincts, these sexual energies, the libidinal energies, are focused less on the body and more on pursuits such as sports and hobbies and activity and social integration. This is referred to as the latency period. So we have a transition from a series of areas of the body in which an individual manages their shift from unpleasure to pleasure, beginning with the oral, then shifting to the anal, and then to the phallic. Then there is a latency, and then finally the genital. And once someone is in the genital stage and has completed this in puberty, they are able to produce children of their own. They're able to love in a non-narcissistic way, focusing on generating love and also working and generating contributions to society as a whole.